Hey, so it's me again. As promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about some notes that I was planning to share with you today in class, but instead I will share them with you in this short video. Okay, let me put myself back down here. Here are the notes in question. Similarities between Gilgamesh and Genesis. Things that I thought might be interesting to think about, especially as we begin talking about the essay topic. Drawing connections is one way of approaching an essay topic. What connections do you see? What patterns do you see? So the first bullet point there at the top of the notes that, here I can make this a little bigger. Let's see how that works. The serpent in chapter 3 of Genesis and the tree of knowledge that the serpent I guess persuades Eve that it's okay to eat from it. It's an interesting moment, right? He gets her to speak, to say too much. He gets her to misrepresent God's words, right? God said not to eat of the tree of knowledge, lest you die. But she says to the serpent that God instructed her not to touch or eat. And it's not what God said. So she kind of misrepresents it after being kind of provoked by the serpent to talk about it. And it's also ambiguous what the consequence is supposed to be for eating or touching, right? Does it mean that you will die immediately or that you will one day die? And notice that for a being who's not aware or conscious of the idea of death, like Eve, that's not a clear distinction. So she touches the tree, she doesn't die, and the serpent has told her that, essentially, God won't kill you for eating this. And so when she touches it and doesn't die, she begins to question. And so then she eats. It's an interesting moment. By the way, the serpent, the word for serpent in Hebrew is very close to the word for Eve, and both are related to the word for life. So Eve, she is tied to the origin of life, and so is the serpent. Serpent here is tied to the origin of life. Certainly, if you read ancient Indian literature, mythology, there is an ancient Indian god, I can't pronounce the name, but that protects the waters, the sort of the life waters, and it's a serpent, right? The serpent sort of surrounds this mountain that contains the life-giving waters. And Indra, a warrior god, goes and destroys the serpent in order to release the waters of life. Right? So there's this interesting story in Indian mythology where the serpent is kind of part of the source of life, in the sense that protects the waters, the life-giving waters. This serpent is part of the story of the the coming to be of Eve and Adam as the beings that they are, right? The banishment from the garden and going out and starting a life on their own, right? This all begins with the serpent. So the serpent is there at the beginning, and what we know as human life, right, comes about as a result of this interaction with the serpent. But we also have the serpent in tablet 11 of Gilgamesh. I think that was pointed out in class. The serpent is the one who slithers away with the herb of youth that Gilgamesh leaves by the pond as he's taking a bath. And that's the last hope of getting something out of this trip, something concrete. He wanted immortality. He got the second best gift in the form of, you know, youth, a youth-giving herb, but he loses it to the serpent. And without the serpent's, you know, slithering off with the herb, right, it would be a different story. Gilgamesh would have gone home with this sense that he was always young, always spry, right? That he would never lose his youth. But he doesn't go home with that sense. He goes home with the acknowledgement not only of his mortality, but of, you know, his limits. He has limits. There are limits to his strength. There are limits to his power. I don't know. And the serpent is responsible for bringing that about, you could say. We could also compare the tree of life in Genesis to the herb of youth in Gilgamesh. Right? Those are interesting comparisons to make. Right? God is very keen on preventing the human from eating from the tree of life and becoming essentially a god. And there seems to be a reason for preventing Gilgamesh from being forever young. But those are interesting connections. Okay, moving on. The curse on Adam and Eve in Genesis. The theme of mortality and the banishment from the garden. They can't eat from the tree of life. Well, we can relate this to Enkidu, and you know, he has to leave the forest. It's a kind of curse. You know, he later curses Shamhat for this, right? He feels cursed by the fact that he had to leave the forest, and he blames it on Shamhat, which is not fair, but he then returns to the forest and kills Humbaba, and this brings on another curse. This brings on the ultimate curse, the curse of death, right? Humbaba is the one who curses Enkidu with death. Enkidu is now conscious of his own death. So you can think about the relationship between those two moments. We then have Gilgamesh facing the reality of his own mortality, and I talked about this in class with the image of Enkidu's nose, the maggots crawling out of his nostrils. And then he flees Uruk. He leaves the city dressed up like an animal. He outruns the sun. We didn't talk about that. He goes through the tunnel, right? This is the idea that at the end of the day that the sun goes into a tunnel and comes out the other end. Well, he runs through that tunnel, and with the sun on his butt, right, about to burn him up. But he outruns the sun and comes out the other end through these mountains. It's almost like he's experiencing death and rebirth, you could say. And at the end, in Tablet 9, what does he see when he comes out the tunnel? He crosses the threshold. He looks and he sees the garden of the gods, this garden made of rocks and gemstones, right? All of the trees and flowers are made of stones, but beautiful gemstones. It's not a place for humans, right? It's a place for the gods, but he gets to see it. He crosses the waters of death. Again, this is a place that he's not supposed to go, right? Where does Gilgamesh belong, right? He meets Utnapishtim at the end of the world, and he dashes his hopes for a cure for death. He can't receive the gift that Utnapishtim received. So the theme of mortality, not being able to eat from the tree of life, Adam and Eve, Enkidu's feeling cursed in leaving the forest, but then cursed with death by Humbaba, and Gilgamesh sort of coming to terms with his own mortality. So the third bullet point here, Cain and Abel. We didn't speak about this in detail, but the story of the older brother killing the younger brother, the origin of murder here. The first murder is the murder of the brother, the one that God favors, right? God favors Abel. Cain kills him. Abel's the younger, right? The firstborn is not favored. But these are the first sons of Adam and Eve living outside the garden, right? This gives, leaving the garden is the beginning of a family life, the beginning of brothers and sisters. And it begins with an act of violence, right? It's not a happy story. Sibling rivalry. That's what life outside of the garden brings, sibling rivalry. And that brings about a curse, right? The curse is interesting. The curse on Cain is not death, but that he wears the mark of being a murderer, so that everyone sees him as a murderer. He has to kind of live in exile or in shame. And he goes out and founds the first city. So you can think about what this tells us about the Hebrew or the ancient Israelite attitude toward cities, toward urbanism, toward civilization. Right? These are people who started out sort of as nomads, as wandering across the desert, hunters and gatherers. Okay, I'm going to pause, and I'll come back in a moment with one last video. It would be about 5 minutes long.